The power of play is the current theme of the Grand Slam Coaches Conference held by Tennis Australia. In today's podcast, I'm going to reflect on week one of the first few presentations that I've watched, why I agree that play is really important, players should be having fun, the issues with traditional tennis coaching, but also some of the mixed messaging coming through from the conference. Welcome, as always, to my tennis coaching podcast. I hope you've all had a great new year. Apologies for the slight delay on this podcast. I only returned back to work yesterday. This podcast was meant to go out yesterday. It was going to be live, but first day back was a little bit chaotic. So I'm recording it on Tuesday. It's going to go out on Thursday on YouTube and on Spotify. So apologies. I am hoping to do a live podcast towards the end of the month. On that note as well, if you are watching on YouTube, slight change in my YouTube schedule. We're going to release the video podcast each and every Monday, and then 2 additional videos on a Wednesday and Friday. And yes, let me know if you do enjoy the new style of content, as always, in the comments. So yesterday was the start of the Australian Open Grand Slam Coaches Conference, a virtual coaching event that I enjoy and I register and enroll each and every year. Hopefully one day I will present at the conference as well. It's on one of my sort of goal lists. And yeah, I really was intrigued by this year's conference because it was the power of play, why we need to bring more play into our tennis sessions. And there was elements of constraint-led coaching, ecological dynamics. A couple of the presenters I know, Sean Malcolm from the UK, Matt Wiggum from the UK originally, but now based out in Australia as well, I know are very constraint-led, approached, focused practitioners. So I was really interested in the conference, and I logged on yesterday morning, quite eager at 9 o'clock UK time, and I started to consume some of the content. And this podcast will be my reflections on the content, why I agree with a lot of the principles that were presented, some issues I have in and around it as well. And there's some mixed messages within the content yesterday. And I think that's not a bad thing, though, because if you have a conference where everyone is singing from the same hymn sheet, it gets a bit boring. You're almost preaching to the converted. I think there has to be slightly different lenses and different views, and I completely accept that as well. My challenge of it, though, sometimes, and I'll get into this a little bit later on, is when you start to mix the methodologies. And there was a presentation in particular where it used quite a lot of ecological dynamics language, but then presented a lot of what I would call traditional practices. And I just don't think the two worlds collide very well. And I think it almost causes confusion, not only in the players, but also the coaching style as well. But let's start off with the positives. I think, listen, through every presentation yesterday, most of the presenters that I watched, I've not watched all of them yet, but most of them talked about the importance of playing the game, whether that be through constraint-led approach with Sean Malcolm, or game-based approaches, or situational play, which was one of the other presentations. We need to learn more via play. And it was great yesterday for people like Sean and Matt Wiggum presented some information of research to show, like, if players learn through a context of a practice that looks and feels like a match, there's a higher transfer of skill, stuff that I talk about on this podcast all the time and my YouTube channel. Like, if we practice similar to a match, there's more transfer. If we practice in isolation and basket drilling and drop feeding, there's very little transfer as well. And that was a very strong message that came through yesterday. I don't think it came through enough. I think it needs to be something that's put out there more. I understand why a lot of federations, and this is not a knock on Tennis Australia, but a lot of federations or coaches don't want to completely throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we've coached this way for 100 years or so. So it's almost saying, well, yeah, we've got that completely wrong, and yeah, this is probably more effective. And I don't see it that way. And I think sometimes with my podcasts and my social media posts, it comes across like I'm anti-basket drilling, and I've never done that. I've coached that way. I know what it's like to coach in that traditional sense. I know the positives of coaching that way. You get quick wins straight away. You can make the player look and feel really good in a very short space of time. It's controlled. It looks like teaching and learning is taking place. The negative side of isolated practices and basket drilling is there's no skill transfer, or there's very little skill transfer. And I think it's in and around less than 30% of skill will transfer. And I can see why coaches and federations don't want to let go of that side of it. And what I'm seeing a little bit now is they're trying to merge the two worlds. Well, let's teach the fundamentals in block practice or fundamentals and lots of repetition, and then we'll get to the constraint-led approach or the situational awareness play or the game-based play a little bit later on. There's still this mentality that we have to isolate the skill, practice it, develop it, and then open it up completely. And it's something that I've been having conversations with coaches from around the world recently. Why do we have to go right down to the minute detail? Why do we have to break it down to the very small point and then go from mini to maxi? Surely it makes more sense starting with the game and working our way back a little bit until we find a point where the level of stress or challenge is there. Because if something's too difficult, and we understand that playing a match or a game of tennis is quite challenging for a beginner. Why? Because there's loads of variability. There's loads of options, and sometimes there's too many options. And if you listen to me rant enough, you'll know I talk about like the all-you-can-eat buffet. You go to the Chinese or Indian or English all-you-can-eat buffet, and there's so much choice, you don't know what to pick. And you end up just picking loads of random stuff, and it doesn't quite go together, and it doesn't quite taste very nice, and you end up leaving half of it, and you probably don't have a great experience because there's too many options. And sometimes when we play tennis, we have that effect as well. There's too many things going on. There's too many variables in play. The ball is going in different places. The opponent is changing. The score is changing. The environment is changing. So one thing that gets lost within ecological dynamics or constraint-led approach is this whole idea of, well, we just play games and we expect that the players get better through playing the game. Doesn't quite work that way. What we have to do from an ecological dynamics point of view or constraint-led approach is we have to look at what's happening, where the player is maybe struggling or even finding success. Doesn't always have to be a weakness. And can we manipulate the task, the environment, or the player and guide them towards better solutions? So we start to strip away some of the variability. What we don't do is bring it all the way down and strip everything away. And we go into isolated practice or drop feeding or just making sure there's only one solution. And that's what a lot of traditional tennis coaching is. We break it down. If you think about the classic hourglass, okay, you do your game assessment, you pick a teaching point, you isolate it, you do lots of volume, block practice with the idea of you're developing the skill. Again, research shows that it doesn't really develop the way we think it does. And then we progress it and then we put it back into the game. The issue is we bring it so far back and we bring it back to the minute detail that it doesn't quite develop, because the point A, which is the isolated practice, and the game, there's too much in between. And that's why I like the funnel of variability. And I'm blanking on the name now of the researcher who came up with that phrase, so apologies. I'll leave it in the show notes. You don't have to bring it all the way to point A. You don't have to bring it to isolated practice. You can just bring it back a little bit, strip back a little bit of the variability, and then start to get some success or challenge. And then you can move it up and down that scale. But traditional tennis coaching, we almost bring it back to the start. We bring it back always to isolated practice, with the idea is you put the building blocks or the foundations in place and then you build it up. But skill is not done that way. Skill is not built on top of each other. Skill is adaptive, and it adapts to the environment that comes across. And I think that's where some of the mixed messaging come across yesterday with some of the presentations. Some of the presentations were talking about representative learning design, but then there was practices that weren't representative. There was a lot of talk about, oh, we've got to have lots of fun and it's got to be game-based. But then playing with hoops and beanbags and balloons and ribbons and stuff again, which is fun. But to me, that's not representative. That doesn't look and feel like tennis. Lots of throwing and catching. Again, throwing and catching, quite important physical literacy skills. But they're different skills to hitting the ball. So if we're talking about making players better at tennis, we have to play more tennis, and that involves having a racket and ball. And again, you're not going to have a complete beginner who is going to play a match. You can get a complete beginner to play floor tennis. You can get a complete beginner to play multiple touch tennis, or play on a bigger court, a smaller court with a bigger ball. You can manipulate the game to get a beginner at all ages and stages to play a game of tennis. And that's one thing I think was missing yesterday. I think there's lots of good discussions on theories, and again, Sean Malcolm did a great presentation on a constraint-led approach. Matt Wiggum did a great presentation on pressure points, how we can bring more chaos and pressure to our matches and make it look and feel more like a match court and stuff. A lot of the other presentations, again, were just around traditional coaching and the idea of fun. And I want to address this now. And I think fun, we get lost with the word fun. And I know people like Chris Suits have talked about this before as well. Fun for me is enjoying what you do. Tennis is fun. I think we do tennis a massive disservice, and we try and put in loads of bells and whistles within tennis. We bring in the hooters, and we bring in the balloons, and when I say hooters, I mean if you're a Miss Hits or She Rallies coach, you know what I mean by hooters. It's not the American bar, but we bring in all these gimmicks. And we bring in the balloons and the pads and stuff like that, and it's great and it's fun, it's chaotic. But then when these kids go and play a match, it's not the same. It's different. It's different skills that they're developing. When you're throwing and hitting a beanbag, it's different skills to hitting the ball. There's a different affordance, there's a different movement opportunity, there's a different movement solution. Again, not saying that these things aren't important. Physical literacy is important. We need to help these kids develop a wide range of skills, not just tennis skills. But if we've got these kids for 1 hour a week, we spend so much time throwing and catching, and the balloons and the fluff, I call it. And then we expect these kids to go and play a tennis match where there's no balloons. It's quite a pressure environment. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of anxiety. It's one-on-one. There's no noise generally. It's quite a quiet environment. There's someone keeping score. There's loads of parents watching. There's other players watching. And we wonder why there's a massive disconnect. Now, I'm not saying every practice has to be like a match practice, but it has to practice elements of the game. And I'm struggling, and you can help me out here in the comments, of any other sport who breaks things down to such a minute level that we do at tennis. I grew up playing football, and the most we broke it down was dribbling around cones, which again, research shows is a waste of time, because in football, your opponents are never static, and they're never sort of a couple of centimetres tall either. They're live, complex movement bodies, and they're reacting to your movement. Cones don't react. And that's probably the less representative, but we spent more time in football training playing football. And I get it, tennis, in some people's eyes, is quite a hard sport. I completely disagree. I think tennis is a relatively easy sport. It's made complicated by people like me, like coaches, because we feel like we need to teach you technique and stuff. And again, I think that was missing from the conference. I'd love to see more about, okay, let's just play tennis. Let's just play tennis, and this is how we can manipulate the game of tennis and how we can break it down and play. I think there's lots of fluff being thrown around at a minute, like constraint-led approach, like ecological dynamics, and game-based coaching and situational awareness. But it's still going back towards that traditional coaching of, okay, we'll throw and catch into a cone. Okay, we'll have a cross-court rally. We'll strip everything away, or we'll bring into the basket feeding and stuff like that. And the neurological priming was another thing that got brought up yesterday. Just random stuff. And it's like, right, let's just play the game. And I know I'm going off on mad tangents here, and I'm just sort of just releasing a lot of the things that I've been thinking about over the past 24 hours listening to the conference. I think conferences like these are great. It's good to have lots of different ideas and different perspectives from coaches from all around the world. But what impact does it have on you as a coach? And I've presented at some conferences, and I'm hopefully going to present some conferences this year. And I've done coach workshops, I've done CPD, I do coach qualifications and stuff. But how much impact does it have? Because yesterday I watched 5 or 6 presentations, And I look at it from a different lens. But even if I'm a coach, I'm looking at some of that stuff and going, well, that doesn't resonate with me because I don't need that at my club. That doesn't resonate with me because I don't understand the theory behind it and the science. So great, I might have some ideas of games, but I don't actually know how to put it into context. I will go to a CPD or I'll go to a conference and I'll watch some great expert presenters and they'll deliver some amazing stuff. But how can I take that and bring it into my 4 o'clock lesson? How can I take that and it's going to help me rethink and reshape my philosophy? And I think what tends to happen a lot is, and I've done this myself, you go to a conference or you watch a conference, you go on the court at 4 o'clock, you'll try out some of the stuff. Some of it will stick and work and you think, oh, I like that. But you've got to change it. You've got to modify it because your players are different. Your environment is different. Some of it will not work at all because it's not been designed for your players. So you throw it out completely and you'll never touch it again. And then after a couple of weeks, you'll just go back to what you've always done because you'll go back to your environment and your players and you'll go back to what you perceive works for your players. But that's an issue as well because if what you're doing is not very efficient and effective, even though you're consuming lots of new knowledge and information, if you haven't got then the backup support to go off and carry on these things, it almost gets lost a little bit. And I've seen this firsthand with sometimes when I've done workshops and I've delivered constraint-led approach or I've done a talk on constraint-led approach and the coaches have loved it. They've come up to me afterwards and go, oh my God, that's really good. And I'm going to buy the book. I'm going to do the drills. I'm going to look in more into the research and read some papers and listen to the Talent Equation podcast and the Perception Action podcast. 2 great podcasts. Go listen to them. I'm going to go a little bit deeper. And they go a little bit deeper for a couple of weeks. And then when I check in with them a little bit later on, it's a case of, well, yeah, I've just gone back. I've gone back because there's no accountability. Or a young coach will go back to their club, really excited about all these new ideas and philosophies, and they want to go off and try it. And the head coach goes, yeah, it's a load of rubbish. I've always done it this way. No. We don't want any of that rubbish here. We don't want any of that constraint-led approach. We don't want any of that game-based stuff. We want to do some basket drilling. And that then just stops that coach from growing. And I think about my journey now as I'm talking to the camera, like 4 years, over the past 4 years, I've explored on the court. I've done some terrible lessons. I've set up some terrible practices. I've got lots of things wrong. But it's made me a much better coach. Because I've been comfortable exploring different ways of communicating, different ways of structuring a lesson, different ways of starting a lesson, finishing a lesson, different ways of presenting information to players. And I've only been comfortable that because I've been going out there and going to conferences and listening to other coaches and taking snippets, but more importantly, taking it back on court and working on it and making myself accountable because I've got to try something new quite regularly because I want to keep improving. And that's the sort of my next question that I'm sort of putting out there to the comments as well. When you go to CPD and workshops, what sticks? What helps you change your way of thinking? Because I'm hopefully going to do some new workshops at some point, maybe this year, maybe next year. But I want it to be a bit more non-linear. I want it to be a workshop where you'll come, we'll maybe share some ideas and some theory, and we maybe get on court and come up with some situations. But then there has to be some backup afterwards. There has to be some, whether it be mentoring or check-ins or coaches send me clips and we can talk through the clips together. There has to be a long-term process. Like, again, shout out to Mark Tennant. Mark Tennant once told me, like, a conference or a CPD or even a coach qualification will not change behaviour. Behaviour is a day-to-day change because if you go to a conference and you see a great flashy presentation for 20 minutes, like I said before, it may last a couple of weeks, but you'll just go back. So how can we make these conferences, like we said before, with the Grand Slam Coaches Conference now, and go and check it out. I'll leave a link in the show notes. It's again, really great conference, lots of great presentations. Looking forward to watching week 2 next week. There's still stuff in there that I think's missing. Like I mentioned before, okay, if we're going to play, let's play tennis. Let's not waste our time throwing and catching and doing all that stuff if we've got once a weekers. And then if we are looking at these conferences, how's it going to stick? How can we change behaviour? It's very hard for me to do it because I'm just one person, and I find it quite tough as well if I'm presenting information and federations are then presenting something different. Who are people going to believe? Me on YouTube or Instagram, or a federation? They're going to look at the federation. And I think federations are starting to look more at game-based approaches. I still think it's not quite being delivered how it should be. It's being delivered as a tool, and constraint-led approach is not a tool. It's a methodology. It's a whole sort of psychology around it. You can't just constrain something and think I'm a constraint-led approach. Again, it's a common thing that I get from a lot of coaches. Oh, I've been using constraint-led approach for years. No, you haven't. You've been constraining to constrain. You've been traditionally breaking things down. You've not been constraining to afford, as we would say. So, demo reflections on the conference. I know I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, so apologies for that. But I think it's important that, okay, we have these conferences. I still think there's that traditional lens just going right through all coach education. And I get it, it's not going to change overnight, and it's great to hear things like representative learning design, great to hear things like constraint-led approach or constraints. But I think it's important that when we are presenting these information, that it's presented in its truest form. It's not just being used as buzzwords. And I think sometimes coaches are guilty of that as well. And I'm a constraint-led approach coach because, look, I'm constraining by making the player only do one thing. That's a mistake I made when I started this approach. We constrain to constrain, so you almost constrain to get a solution, whereas constraint-led approach is constraining to afford. We offer them multiple solutions. Let me know in the comments if you have watched the Grand Slam Coaches Conference. Have you enjoyed it? What presentations did you enjoy? 2 presentations, again, I will really highly recommend are Matt Wiggins and Shawn Malcolm's from week 1. I've not yet looked at week 2. I'll do a video next week and a podcast on my thoughts on week 2. But they're my thoughts. Hopefully it's made some sense. Please check out the link below from my Drills to Skills course. So if you are interested in trying to change a little bit of your coaching, making it a bit more relevant and making sure more skill transfers, check out the link below from Drills to Skills. As always, if you are on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're on Spotify, please like and follow. And until next week podcast, I'll speak to you soon.